All right, I say we're good to get started here. Thank you, everyone, for joining. What is this? It's April, right? Our fourth of our annual webinar series here at Draft.dev, covering all things developer relations and dev marketing. Clayton, Kast, head of accounts here at Draft. I'll be our host today. We're also joined by Randall and Garrett. Randall heads up developer relations and community at Snyk. They, honestly, you guys are one of our favorite examples to point people to when it comes to just generally developer relations and marketing in general, but you guys also handle your education very well. Also, Randall's got a colleague over there, Laird, who is just a king when it comes to education also, so definitely check out both of their stuff. And then Garrett runs a company that assists with our topic today, which is documentation and education driven by AI tools, and then also just within their product itself, because of self-use, they have to make sure they're on top of their own stuff when it comes to documentation education also. With that, the topic we're covering today, we're going to be focusing on proper documentation and developer education. Here at Draft, where we do like technical marketing content, we have people come to us a lot where they're gung-ho and excited to start community development, developer marketing, ready to hit the ground running, hitting some of those goals that maybe their investors have put in front of them when it comes to outreach. And then we start talking to them and we find out that they haven't even really started fleshing out their documentation process yet, or UI is not great, UX isn't very effective. We find that this tends to end up falling to the back burner on priority as you're developing a product and fleshing it out. But product documentation and education is essential, not only to seeing the success of your product when it comes to usage, but also to adoption. We joke a lot of time. We're like, if devs can't find your quick start guide and effectively get it up and running in the first like 50 minutes of finding your site, they're probably moving on to something else. So with that, Garrett, Randall, I'm going to start with a super vague question like we always do at webinars. So tackle this how you will, then we'll get into the nitty gritty as we move on. But just broadly speaking, via both of your experiences, what do you think are sort of the main points of effective product documentation? What do you consider exceptional? And if you have, like, rather than going into the details, you just have some organizations that you want to recommend, or I'll also drop Snyk's internal community sites too. I'll try and keep up to your answers and drop some information in the chat. But maybe I know, Randall, you're going to speak to Snyk specifically, probably. So, Garrett, let's start with you. What are some elements that you typically see drive the most effective product documentation and education?
Yeah, sure. I mean, Snyk is a great example too, but I'll let Randall sort of cover that to start. A couple that we think are really good, and we've actually used ourselves, is Stripe first, of course. I think everybody thinks of Stripe as like the go-to. That's the ideal image of what documentation could be. And there's a few reasons for that. One, they support multiple coding languages, so it's really easy to get started. And then they have a lot of code walkthroughs and example apps, so you can take a real example and then reverse engineer your way back from there. Something else that we've seen pretty good as well is Tailwind, especially since you're making UI. What they do is they give you these... they show you how the code snippets actually have an effect with visualizations. So you can see what the code snippet is actually going to do with visualization before you actually put it in. Those are a couple of examples that I can think of off the top of my head.
Oh, you're muted.
There we go. Yeah,
there
sorry.
you go.
I was struggling to unmute properly. Sorry, everyone. But first of all, thanks for having me. Good to see all of you out there in the audience. By the way, if you have questions or random commentary, please do use the QA functionality. I'll sort of look at it asynchronously and try to answer stuff if I can. But I'm going to give you a totally non-Snyk related answer because I don't want to be very self-promotional today.
You guys do a great job, though. I'm dropping the link anyways.
Well, thank you. Yeah, appreciate that. But I'll share two sort of opinions first off, and then I'll actually just screen share and show you some examples if I can. So first thing, when you're talking about building like a really good set of documentation for developers, it actually starts like before you ever get to documentation. And there's two main elements. Like the first is that your website, wherever people land, needs to make sense. And it sounds like a really easy thing to do, but so many companies have these websites where it's just absolutely nonsensical and it's extremely difficult to understand what your product even does. And I think the reality is if you're a developer or a technical user using a service that you need to actually interact with as a practitioner, you have to be able to understand it. And all the enterprise buzzwords and all the marketing jargon is just really a distraction that gets in the way of having adoption for your product. So I want to give a shout out to Assembly AI. You can see the screen here. So I have a couple of good friends who work here. They do a really, really great job with their documentation and developer relations. But this is their homepage, and you can sort of see it says, hey, we're going to turn your voice data into transcripts and summaries with our leading speech AI models. And it makes it extremely easy to understand what the heck they're actually doing, you know, not the buzzwords around it, but what they're actually doing. Secondly, when you actually start talking about documentation and how to make things work, you have to keep two things in mind. The first is that your product itself has to make sense to the person. And so what that means to me is, you know, let's say you're building a web app and you're going to host a web app somewhere. You as a user already have some expectations in your head of what the optimal like way to deploy an application is going to be. And so the service that you're using has to adhere to like your mental model of the domain. Like what should it be doing in an ideal case? And then your documentation should just fill in any gaps and make sure that if there are particular things people need to know, they can easily find it. And I think Heroku, even though they've been around for forever, Salesforce acquired them way back when, Heroku has some of the best, most straightforward, clear-cut documentation in the game. So if you go to their developer center and you sort of just take a look at some random articles down here, like I'll just click on anything, custom domain names for apps. All their documentation is standardized. It's really easy to understand. I understand as a developer, if I'm deploying an application onto this platform, how can I easily figure out how to add a custom domain name to it? And they have a nice table of contents. I can clearly see exactly what I need to do. I can jump down, and each of these sections is short. It's straight to the point. It has warnings for things that are important to understand just to catch your attention, but they're just really, really simple to get a hold of. And I think they've done a tremendous job there. So yeah, obviously Stripe and everyone else does a great job on the API side. I would just call out like a couple of these other examples for some places who have some other good supporting stuff there.
Awesome. So right off the back, we're hitting a quick trend, which I feel like when a lot of people focus or, to be honest, stress about updating their documentation, it's the technical content itself and accuracy, which is correct, but it's really quick to, I would say, overwhelm a reader in any space. So it's really the organization of that information may be just as important, or if not potentially more important. I don't want to say more important than the technical accuracy, but if people aren't able to figure out how to get to the information that they need to be successful, it's just going to be all for naught, right? So what do you find to be the best ways to drive success in organizing that data? Maybe some tips or best practices or observations that you guys have seen. And I have a feeling the answer may be it depends, but be curious to hear what you have to say.
I'll go first on this one. I feel like this is more of a pitch for Garrett though, but you know, I think the best practice for documentation always is to always keep one thing in mind: simplicity. You want to make the simplest possible explanation for people so they can understand things and do absolutely nothing else. You just want it to be straight to the point, skip all the fluff, give people exactly what they need. There's a lot of benefits of that. Like first and foremost, it makes it easier for you as the person organizing documentation and managing like an overall program. It makes it easier to build a program out because you have a much more clear, streamlined idea of what things you have gaps on that you need to cover, what things you have already. You can easily get users to the places they need to be without a lot of like, should I send them here? Should I send them there? Like a lot of conflicting stuff. So just have single purpose, simple, straightforward documentation whenever possible. The other thing I want to mention is, and this is probably a lot more relevant right now than, you know, any time in the last few years, but there's a huge amount of emphasis on making sure that your documentation and just the way you phrase things is accessible to anyone using your service, whether it's someone who's like just getting started or someone who's been using it for a few years and understands maybe more things, but still needs some information. And I think that plays really well into using a lot of generative AI research tools. Like if you're just asking questions on ChatGPT to help understand how to use a service or how to do something, you obviously want these LLMs to have information about your services and be able to comprehend them well. And one of the best ways to do that is to just have simple, straightforward documentation so that when all of these things show up in search engine indexes and companies like OpenAI and Anthropic and all these others end up using those indexes to help train their models, your stuff is going to be in there. It's going to be simple. It's going to be straightforward, and people will get good quality answers that they need.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think it's so easy when you're launching a new feature, for example. You're so in the weeds, you're so excited about launching it. And so you want to write up as much as you can because you're a developer, right? And it's hard to forget sometimes that you need to keep it as simple as possible because people don't understand your product like you do. And so you need to make sure that it's really easily digestible. There is an argument to be made that semantic search is really useful, especially for complex documentation sites. So for us, we're still pretty small, pretty lean, so it's not a huge issue. But when you start looking into the enterprise and you have documentation sites with 4,000, 5,000 links, just doing a simple keyword, if that results in 100, 200 links that you need to now sift through, semantic search is a really good option there.
I really like that you brought up the point of assuming knowledge within your audience, the balance you have to strike there. It's something that we run into a lot in content creation on our own. I can't even imagine having to do it from baseline documentation. So how do you, I guess, tackle each individual audience level, or how do you create materials that will educate both effectively, whether it be the pro at this particular topic you're speaking to, or the new user, or something that we find a lot over at Draft is like, it may be something that is someone that is extremely experienced, like senior dev in this area where we're speaking to, but they may be incredibly new to this new emerging technology. So there's sort of a juxtaposition there. Curious to see how you guys like to tackle problems like that.
Randall, you might have some more experience than we do with this. So I'm gonna put that on you.
Yeah, sure. So a couple things. I learned this through trial and error the hard way myself, and it wasn't actually a documentation related thing. It was from public speaking. So one of the things I learned is I've been doing like DevRel kind of jobs as like a lead technical person for a very long time in my career. And I remember the very first time I ever gave a technical talk at an event. It was like a local event in the LA area, which is where I'm from. And I got invited to speak on this topic about like building this like telephony API service and the technology behind it and stuff. So I was like, okay, I'm going to have to spend a ton of time on this and make it really great. I was extremely nervous. So I put all this time into prepping the presentation. And as I was doing it, my most nervous like anxiety was telling me that I had to make sure that the content was like super advanced so people be really impressed, and that everyone in the audience would learn like a ton of crazy stuff that they just didn't think about. And so in the presentation, I leaned really heavily into like the most advanced parts of this and all the very niche particular problems that I ran into, which were, super interesting to me as someone with a ton of domain experience there. And I rehearsed this talk for probably like 80 hours. And so I go and I give this 45-minute talk at a meetup, and I could tell it was not going well because everyone's eyes were glazed over. People were bored. Like it just wasn't an interesting presentation. And I learned the hard way from that presentation that, whenever you're doing any sort of content for anyone, whether it's a presentation or documentation or a blog post or a YouTube video, whatever it is, you can't guarantee who your audience is. People can always self-select into things, but at the end of the day, a topic is going to be interesting to people of more beginner skill sets, intermediate, advanced. And so you should always cover things from the beginning and the ground up as if the audience has no idea what you're talking about. And I've done that in every single presentation and blog post I've written since then. And it's been a complete difference. Like even if you go and give a talk on an extremely complex topic, like, post-quantum cryptography is something that I've spoken about recently, and I'll go to a conference and present on that. But breaking it down so that even the beginners in the audience understand it and have fun with it and can get the value out of it is like the most important thing by far. It's almost like, if you think of it as like a combination of education and entertainment, like you want both of those things to be an effective educator. And it's the same in your writing, it's the same in your presentations, in all the different media formats that you might be getting into.
Yeah, I totally agree. We actually ran into this issue pretty recently because we work in the AI space, of course. We've been working in it since before ChatGPT came out. And so it's easy to think that, everybody's on the same sort of level as you, right? And people are doing the same amount of research as you are. And sometimes you need to take it back to the bare bones. So for example, we just launched this new product offering, which basically takes web data. It's like a web data crawler. And it cleans up the data, puts it into Markdown. So it's a really clean format that then you can feed to an LLM. Now, it was almost like tribal knowledge to us that you want to take web data and put it into Markdown first, because you have much better results. Turns out that when we started talking to people, they didn't understand why we translated things into Markdown in the first place. So we had to take a step back and be like, okay, we need to start from the very beginning here. This is the process that we do. This is why we do it. This is the value that you get out of it. And then you can now start to take our tool and use it for these reasons.
I love that so much. I really like that example because it's like the perfect example of something that like everybody runs into. It also made me think of something I was just literally, I think earlier today, like 2 hours ago, on a call with a coworker talking about something similar, which is at Snyk. So our company, if you're not familiar with it, it's like a developer security tool. And so our product will basically analyze code, dependencies, things like that, and help find and fix security issues. And a lot of the fixing components are AI focused. So with that context in mind, what we were talking about before is I was having a conversation with a developer, and I was like, yeah, we can have this agent-based thing where we like take some code and process it from this point of view, and then we send it to this other, we prompt a different thing over here, and then we combine these results and do stuff. And one of the foundational questions they had was like, that's great, but when I'm using ChatGPT or just firing requests off to the API, I can't like force the result to come back in JSON. So maybe they ask it a question and they say, please, output in this style of JSON. And it does like 4 out of 5 times, but then that 5th time it errors out. And so their question essentially boiled down to, how do you like enforce some sort of structured output from the LLMs that you're using so you can actually reliably take the results and send it back and forth? And that ended up spurring on a whole conversation about, oh wait, yeah, like this is an important topic. And there's so many things to cover in that basic area that you just need to build this big foundation on top of it before you sometimes get to these other things. And so it definitely like keeps you humble as you're working on things for sure.
I definitely understand like a lot of organizations need to or desire to assume that their potential users are extremely talented at what they do. It's sort of like, I'm going to sell myself out on how much of a nerd I am, but like animes are known trope-wise for just like rehashing the story points over and over again and just sort of throwing it in your face, and they can frustrate you as an audience sometimes. But it can be something as simple as like linking out to like, oh, by the way, we use Markdown here. Here's the link out to why we use Markdown. Give your audience the opportunity to continue to educate themselves in that area. We're sort of dabbling into it here, and I feel like this is another great a point to dive into, which is customer feedback within your documentation education. So obviously you want to take it in, but how do you guys structure adjusting to customer feedback when it comes to that? And maybe like preventing overreaction too. Like sometimes you don't want to just be immediately reacting to that feedback you're getting, and just making sure that you're having successful growth, I guess, within your documentation.
All right, I'll go first again if you want.
Yeah, go for it.
All right, so I think this question is really great. It is highly dependent on the size of your company and team. Like maybe that's the most important variable for that. So when I was working as like an early employee at like some tech startup companies, my thought process was wildly different than what it is right now at Snyk, where we have like a big team. So in the early days, what I would do is like in DevRel, my job was to both build the developers' client libraries that people would use to interact with our API service, as well as to document it, as well as to get adoption for it. So like doing educational stuff, blog posts, speaking events, whatever. And back then, my thought process was, because I'm the person doing all this work, I take customer feedback extremely seriously. Like if someone would write me an email and say, hey, in support, I can't figure out how to do this thing, I would take that as almost like a personal like mission of my life, is to make sure that no one ever asks that question again. So it's like, all right, if it's a developer library thing, I can tweak to either add a method or a class or something to make it more simple, so people can figure it out easily. I would spend a bunch of time doing that before even responding to them. And I would prefer that all of my support responses be linking to an actual release notes page where I could tell people, hey, thanks for the feedback. By the way, I made a new release. Here's how to do it. It's in the documentation or whatever it is. More simply, thank you so much for the contribution. And people are like blown away with that level of engagement and like support, right? At a bigger company though, it's just not feasible to do that. You have way more users, first of all. You have way more feedback. And then you also learn over time, as your product scope gets bigger, right? Like Garrett, you were talking about enterprise stuff earlier, and like the scope is massive at these big companies. People just miss things. And a lot of the time it's just organization, referencing, like getting people to the right resources. And so in that case, you basically have to move to a more enterprising model. Like we're going to have proper tickets. We're going to evaluate these things with the support team. We're going to escalate the important things for paying customers up to engineering to add features in or whatever it is. But it almost slows down by necessity, just because when you have all these people, the communication bottlenecks are way more, and it's just, you just can't keep the same level of service up at every stage. So it's tough.
Randall, I love that you cared so much about the customer, and that has like so many lasting effects. For example, we use Post-Hog for our analytics, and there was an issue a few months ago. This is probably like 6-7 months ago, a billing issue, and they were on it like that. Within an hour, they had issued us a refund. We were super happy with their service, and we're probably never going to move away because we had such a great experience with their support team. And so as a DevRel, that's so important to developers to show that you care. And I know that that's definitely harder at a much more scaled company. But really glad that you were able to do that at a startup. For us, we're a pretty lean team. And so we have tons of feedback coming in as well. But we also have a million other things on our plate that we have to do. So something that we started experimenting with, and I think it's worked pretty well so far, is we basically provide an AI search for documentation. We were one of the first ChatGPTs for developer documentation. And with all of these questions coming in, what it really is it's people communicating directly with your product. Is a way of thinking about it, right? They're having a conversation with your product. They're asking questions. They're getting answers, or they might not be getting answers. So what we did is we built this little tool that basically does high-level analytics of the conversation. So we do topic clustering to see, okay, what are the topics that people are talking about? And we should make sure that we really focus on the documentation there to make sure it's really good if that's what people are using our product the most for. Additionally, when you ask a question and we don't find any information to give you an answer, we say, basically, there's no answer found. And then we can track those topics as well. So what are the questions that are people asking in the documentation that actually don't have answers, which is an indication for us that we should actually go build documentation around this, if it makes sense. There's also a lot of questions that are asked that are completely useless, but you're able to filter through those.
It's hard. I'm curious, how do you track the gaps in documentation? I feel like that's almost a product in and of itself. Like analyze the business and then tell you, hey, you need to create all these different missing things here or something. But how do you do that, Garrett?
Yeah, that's a really good question. For now, it's pretty bare bones. Like I'd mentioned, we basically just use the no answer found topic cluster to try and understand. Because that way we see, okay, if 10 developers have asked us about this one integration that we don't have, clearly, or maybe, this is an integration that's really important because so many developers have asked about it. We should probably go build that in the right documentation on it.
I like that. That's a good system. I have not found a great way to do that, just in case anyone's watching this who like wants a perfect answer. For us, it's still a problem. I think one of my colleagues, Mike, is actually listening to this in real time right now. He's part of our Snyk Learn team who produces lots of educational lessons and training sessions and things like that. And we actually talk about this internally quite a bit, which is like, when you get to a certain size, you have a lot of people working on a lot of different things, covering them from different personas and angles and documentation and lessons and workshops and trainings and all this different stuff. How do you at scale identify gaps in your stuff? I would love to know. We're still sort of playing around with it. Like, we have some Kanban style systems that we use loosely to like track some of it, but yeah, it's tricky.
Yeah, it is.
Just in general with these projects, like, it's not it can be similar to like tied to marketing KPIs in a way. Like, how are you measuring success? And this goes in turn with the conversation of gaps. Like, we, for example, do a ton of integration guides because it's something that our clients can send to us. It's like, here, you guys deal with these, send them back to us. There's some of our clients are like measuring the success of those by how many customer service calls they eliminate. So if we're able to, answer 50 client questions a month with this one doc, we view that as a success or something like that. How are you guys attaching measurables to some of the work you're doing in the education documentation space?
I will also defer this to Randall because we actually don't do a lot, at least in terms of measurables. It's all very, it's reactive and it's not numbers based. It's very qualitative.
Okay, I have like a million thoughts on this. I'll try to keep it brief because I don't want to monopolize all the talking in this. But yeah, there's a couple different things. So first of all, what everyone's go-to like metric is they look at their website, they look at the docs pages on their website, and they say, how many views are our docs getting? More views, the better. Which is almost the exact opposite of what you really want if you think about it, right? Like, you want things to be simple enough that people don't need the references very often, because that's a sign of like a product, like sort of UX weakness almost, if you will. So like, I don't like that. Another thing people sometimes do is they take a look and say, okay, well, is the goal of our documentation and community to reduce support cases? And so what they'll do is they'll take a look at places like Stack Overflow, where questions are tagged with your company name or your tool name or whatever. They'll take a look at places like Quora or your company Discord or Slack or whatever it is, and try to gauge things that way. But again, is what you want for more people to be asking questions about you, or for less people to be asking questions about you, or is there a balance in the middle? So the third thing that I really like to do is I actually, any sort of educational stuff you produce, whether it's documentation, presentations, whatever it is, can have multiple purposes. Like, one purpose is when people need to understand something, having information for them so they can understand it and solve their problem is like the first use case. The second use case is for promotion. So if you're writing things in such a way that anyone, even someone who's not a user of your tool at all, can come and learn something interesting and understand it, and either sign up for your service, which is great, or just get the knowledge they need and go bounce and solve their problem somewhere else, that's also really great for building awareness and like promoting yourself and your services and your tools. So I guess the way I like to view it is you want to think of it from both the marketing perspective in terms of how do we get more reach out of the things we're doing, as well as from the technical perspective of how do we get people the answers they need as quickly as possible and as infrequently as possible, so they don't need to reference us all the time when they get stuck.
Randall, how do you go about measuring like time to value or time to first success? Because for us, right, the ideal customer journey that we have is someone comes on, they go sign up, they ingest their data via API, and then they go deploy their application once the data is ingested ideally that should take like 30 minutes, but it's really hard for us to track, okay, where are the successes happening? Where are the failures happening? Why are these failures happening? So I'm curious what you've done at Snyk for that.
Yeah, I mean, at Snyk, one of our key metrics is time to fix, which is basically like, we want someone to sign up for a service, and an ideal flow looks something like this. Someone signs up for free, they take any GitHub project they have or any piece of code, and they point Snyk at it and say, scan this for issues. It finds at least one issue, but we don't consider like finding an issue our activation metric. Our activation metric is much more focused on, were we able to help someone fix the issue? So we want time to fix as our sort of like North Star, if you will. So we put a lot of emphasis into finding ways to help people fix things better. In our case, that's resulted in a ton of product innovations over the last like 6 years. So back in the day, what we used to do is we would show people vulnerabilities and give them information about the vulnerabilities so they could read more about it and whatever. Then we evolved from there to going to the next level, which was we built our own GitHub sort of analysis database. This is way back when, 7 years ago probably. And we started finding examples of the vulnerabilities people found in their own projects in open source projects. And then we analyzed those projects to see, how did these projects fix this issue? So we built a training set based on that. And in our product, we actually show people, okay, well, here's your problem, here's your issue, here's some information about it. And by the way, here's actual links to GitHub commits where you can go and see how some other people fixed it. Then from there, we got to the point where we actually built pull request integration into GitHub and, you know, similar flows with Bitbucket and all them, where we could actually send a pull request to fix things asynchronously so people could review it on their own and merge it in if they wanted to. And then fast forward to about a year ago or so, we released our IDE plugins. So you can have this happening in real time in your IDE. You get a little red underline notification saying, hey, this is a security issue. Would you like us to rewrite this code for you to fix the issue? You click the button and it uses some LLM stuff behind the scenes to actually rewrite the code, update it inline in the editor, and then rescan it for issues. Like, it's just this like constant evolution of trying to get to value faster and just give people a better experience.
Sort of seems like an evolution of like initially educating on the product, and then as it becomes more mature, you want to get the functionality and the support around it to the point where they're not even having to hit those initial materials. Like even in our business all the time, it's not, okay, this customer's struggling or we're not hitting the mark here. How can the process improve? Not necessarily, you know, how does the individual details within this individual product need to improve? How do you sort of view the life cycle of education and documentation around a product from launch to maybe like late stage maintenance and everything in between? How do you tackle it like a lifestyle, or do you just view it as like continued maintenance of making sure that typical materials are up to speed? Where's the strategy there?
Go for it.
I was going to say mine's probably pretty small because, as I mentioned, we're a pretty small team. So we have pretty lean docs.
I think your perspective is critical too, though, because so many of the people out there in our industry are small teams where everyone's juggling like 18 different balls. They're like, we got to worry about documentation now. Like, what's going on?
Yeah, and it's especially updating it. Creating it isn't too big of a deal, but updating it is an absolute mess that no one wants to do. And I think that's the problem, right? Is that everybody knows it needs to get done, but it always falls lower on the priority list until you start running into real issues, and then you start acting really reactive, trying to make a bunch of fixes at once, and your hair's on fire. But a few practices that we just try to do is before we launch a new feature, for example, we write down the documentation a couple days before, make sure it looks good on our end just by doing some tests here and there, sending it to our colleagues, making sure that they understand what's going on, send it to a few of our trusted beta testers. They go test it. If it looks good, that's great. If we need to iterate, that's fine too. We just get feedback from them. And then we launch with the documentation with the new feature.
And I'll just add to the Snyk thing too. So in a little bit bigger size, one of the things I really like to do is you want to have, ideally in your product engineering group, you want to have a culture where the people building the products are also oftentimes like writing the documentation, or at least bare minimum, like collaborating with someone on the documentation. You don't want to have like a documentation team totally removed from what's going on in the product, because then you get into weird, funky instances where either you have stuff launching, it's just totally undocumented, or maybe stuff's launching and like it's not phrased properly, or like it doesn't make sense from the technical point of view because there's so much separation there. So you just want to keep things like as close as possible to give people a really good experience. And yeah, that's actually probably the main thing I would say.
That's huge. I've been saying a lot lately that like by the time I retire, leave my career in technical content, I want people to stop trying to outsource like product marketing, thought leadership, and documentation. We get so many calls of people that are trying to outsource materials that simply need to be written by your own internal experts. Like, you guys are the pros for the reason. I often compare it to it's oversimplifying, but it's like typing out a prompt. And by the time you get done with it, you're like, why the hell didn't I just write that myself? It would have been just as easy for our team. It would have been communicated more effectively too. Could not agree more. It's a huge point.
Yeah, it's and I think there's some automations that could, help keep that internal. So like we built this, it was sort of a hacky tool, but it definitely works. Where we had a Slack channel called Mendable Messages, and every single question that came in that didn't return an answer or was rated thumbs down, it would send into our Slack, so we could read every single question that was being asked that had a bad result. And so there was this one time where we had pushed a change, but we didn't update the documentation. It was throwing an error. So what we did is we built this this AI tool that basically you can respond in Slack to the bot and say, hey, at Mendable, the code is now this instead of this. And it'll go, okay, that makes sense. It'll then go search through our documentation in GitHub, rewrite it with those changes, and then submit a pull request. So all we need to do is go review the pull request, make sure the documentation looks good, and then accept it. So then the documentation's up to date without us having to actually go in and rewrite it.
That is so cool. I want that. Like, how do we get that? Because I want.
Yeah, I'll show. Let's connect after this. I'll show you how we did it. It's pretty cool.
Yes, give it to me. I want it.
Yes.
Hell yeah. On that note, let's sort of get a little bit more tactical. What tools do you guys consider just invaluable when it comes to creating that developer journey and documentation?
It's a good question. That's a really good question for my CTO. We have a pretty good Markdown editor. That's the main one we use, and then we like the tools that we've built in house, like the GitHub editor that I had mentioned just now.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. So it's a really, really good question. I had to think about it for a minute. I'd say there's maybe two things. Like, one is you want to have some sort of system for reviewing stuff over time. Like, one of the things we establish here at Snyk is we say, okay, based on the type of content, how often does it need technical review and refreshing, basically? So I'll give you a couple really good examples of things that like I've argued with people about in the past. So like YouTube videos is a good one. If your company's producing some YouTube videos that are technical in nature, they are going to become outdated, like at some point, right? And so what is your expected longevity for these videos? Is it supposed to be up to date and accurate for a year, for 2 years, for a month? And then what is your policy for getting rid of stuff if it's dated? Do you just leave it there as a public archive, sort of like a blog where there's an expectation that things that are older are not going to be accurate, but they're good historical references for things? Or do you treat it as though everything's always up to date and you're doing a lot of pruning and like refreshing and things like that? So I think one of the best things just to do, to be honest, is to just set clear expectations with the other stakeholders and say like, hey, videos are going to be accurate for a year. Blog posts are going to be accurate for a year. Product marketing information and cheat sheets will always be up to date, and they're going to be reviewed once a quarter and refreshed or whatever it is. But like setting some sort of like guidelines and boundaries around it is one of the most important things in the toolkit, I would say, just to like make sure you're not missing expectations, I guess is the best way to put it.
well, like if you're big, like enterprise level, it becomes an impossible task really quick to keep everything up to date. We get this question a lot too, where like just quote version histories for everything that's used. They're used to this idea in content of like refresh. You're going to rank higher. It's going to do great. But then like once people actually started trying to execute that strategy, everyone went, oh crap, like this isn't, you can't. It's just not possible. So totally agree with say
every couple of years, I have a conversation like this internally where people are like, what's a refresh strategy for this? And a lot of it, like what we've decided is a lot of it is going to stay as an archival format. Like dated stuff, there's like, we're not going to have the time to go back. Like on Snyk's blog right now, I think there's 700 technical articles, I want to say. There is no way we're going to have people go in to 700 technical articles and review them once. Like there is just no way that's ever going to happen. And so, it's hard.
Well, people come to us and like, just refresh these like 30 pieces for us. And we now have learned our lesson. And like, we're going to approach them as new articles. Like we'll reflect on what you had previously written, but we're generally going to start from scratch when it comes to writing these things again. So we talked, this sort of got mentioned early on, but I think it's worth focusing on. And Randall, this may be another one where you have more perspective on the larger scale, but different audiences, and I mean that by like languages, cultures, areas of the world you're from, like everyone's going to approach that documentation from a potentially different lens. It could even be different industries. So we see this all the time where like how one person writes about a subject for this company versus that company is drastically different. And they would argue with each other that each of them are wrong when they're speaking about the exact same technical task. They just have different perspectives on its application. Curious to see how you sort of navigate some of those potential opportunities for misunderstandings.
There's like two approaches you can do. One approach is to have like a unified company narrative and vision. So like at Snyk, for example, the vision is help fix security problems for developers, right? And so you can get more granular in there and say, okay, well, what is the Snyk opinion on using generative AI to create code? Well, okay, it's great to use it because it helps you code faster. Maybe it can also add in some weird hallucinations and vulnerabilities, which is bad. So maybe you need to be careful, right? But like you have some narrative, you share it with the rest of the company. And then when people are doing all their content creation and different things, they have that in mind so that like the end voice kind of is like uniform. The other approach, which works better in my opinion, is just having a ton of diverse voices. Like personally, I don't even care if something sounds businessy or professional or enterprisey or whatever. There's some people we hire who are going to create things in that tone and in that voice and with that sort of audience in mind. There's some people like me, I'm a good example, who's much better at talking to like an actual developer practitioner, a little bit more scrappy and sort of like hacky, if you will. And you like, if you have diverse voices and can do outreach to all those people, it's just a bigger audience. You're going to serve more people, right? And so both approaches work. I would say the more diverse approach is really nice. Like when we're hiring into my team, we specifically look for people who have strengths that none of us have. And we want them to bring in something totally different and cool and their own thing to make it really fun and interesting for people.
Could not agree more. We see a lot of like ghostwriting in our space, and I sort of prefer the idea of like let the person put their name at the bottom of what they wrote, so they can see where that perspective and that opinion is going to link out to their X, their LinkedIn, their GitHub. Let's drive a little bit more understanding. Totally. So
yeah,
go ahead, Garrett. Roll. I'll just go on to the next question.
I've never thought about catering to a diverse set of audiences, really, because as a team, we've always been working in the DevTools space. We've always been working with developers, but some people started leveraging our tech to make technical information digestible for non-technical folks, specifically in go-to-market teams, that being like customer success, sales, people who sell technical products, but they don't understand the nitty-gritty. And obviously that causes some issues, but when people would come to our site, right, and you're on calls with customers or potential customers, it was intrinsically obvious to us that the developers who came on and we were talking with knew exactly what was going on, had a really good understanding of the product, how it worked. The non-technical folks, not so much, because all of our documentation is catered towards that technical audience. So that's a really good point that you made. Something we got to consider.
One of many, I'm sure. Garrett, I'm lining you up on this next sort of like final question that we have listed here. But I think it's pretty critical. It gets exhausting. I think on some days about how everyone's like AI is changing this space, but legitimately like AI and LLMs are changing to how we're going to be approaching. Like you're saying, when you've got 700 potential documents or subjects to cover, that's it. That's just a golden opportunity for AI to play a role. So maybe like both you guys forward looking, where's it go, or what maybe hasn't been done yet that you think there's potential for to really expand on it in this space?
Oh, there's so much opportunity here. I could go on for a really long time, so I'll try and keep it brief. But I see a couple things. So in the short term, we're seeing more companies come out with like these AI searches, these AI copilots on their documentation. So we can work on accelerating time to value, right? If I come in as a developer, instead of having to keyword search or look through the documentation, if I can just say, here's my use case, I'm trying to do X, can Mendable do X so that I can get Y benefit, right? And you can find the specific docs that give you that information. You're off to a great start. In the longer term, I'm not sure if we're even going to have to write documentation anymore or update it, which I think is going to be awesome for us and for developers. So in theory, right, we should be able to detect changes in the source code and automatically either generate new documentation or update existing documentation based off of those changes. I think that's going to be great, because then we don't have to sit there wondering, okay, what do we need to update? What are SLAs for updating these types of content? That might be a bit harder with YouTube videos, but at least for text, it makes it should be pretty quick to do that. And then you can get into things like function calling, right? So if we can understand the context of a developer's environment, maybe you could do this in a VS Code extension, for example. AI might be even able to use the documentation and your source code and what they're trying to do to help actually deploy what they're trying to deploy right from the get-go.
Yeah,
but we'll see. That's longer term.
I totally agree. But by the way, this is like the most interesting question by far, I would say, for people watching, because it directly impacts the work all of us are going to be doing for the next like 20 years probably. So yeah, my personal thought is, and we've made dramatic changes at Snyk and just in the way that I sort of view the future of like developer experience and stuff myself personally. But yeah, the way I would say is we have LLMs that are capable of generating written content extremely well. Way better than most humans, like, just to be totally frank, right? Like they could do a really, really good job. On the other hand, they're not experts in domains. They're experts in lots of training data and stuff. So there's always going to be a need for expertise. And so how do you sort of like keep yourself like distinguished and valuable and doing really cool work? It's in a couple ways. First of all, it's being an expert in something and like staying on the bleeding edge of it, which as developers, like we're kind of used to doing that all the time anyways, but just like it's more important now than ever. The second thing is that in the future, like a lot of the discussion around documentation and content and things like that today is geared at like a growth perspective. It's like, hey, how do we get more adoption for the products? How do we get more people to learn about the products? How do we get more registrations for our products and services, right? So it's like a marketing kind of function. And going forward, I think having blog posts and documentation just isn't enough. You basically have to be entertaining. And that's what I was sort of mentioning slightly before, is like education's not enough. You need education and entertainment. You need like the edutainment thing like now. Like it's a huge priority. So if you want to talk about how this works out practically, so I lead the DevRel group of Snyk. We made a dramatic change about a year ago. We said, okay, our previous strategy was almost 100% focused on writing. And it was focused on writing because it's something all of us can do. We hired people in the team who are really great writers, respected people in the space. And it's a scalable medium to reach a lot of people because people are Googling for stuff and finding it and reading it and getting information, right? It's great. What we've done now is we've actually taken a key part of the team and pivoted them to 100% focus on video. Like they're just doing like really short form, entertaining, educational YouTube videos on developer security. And those have been performing extremely well. And I think, you know, if you want to future-proof yourself and your programs and your companies and things like that, the best thing to do is think through, all right, what is the stuff I want to see the most? And for me, I find myself more often nowadays like scrolling through interesting technical YouTube videos and watching them and just enjoying the entertainment. So like you want to like be able to build a relationship with people in that way. You want to have these like personal connections in some sort of scalable way. So for me personally, I say video is huge. Also, software development's huge. Just like being able to build open source tools and stuff that are complementary to your product, that are going to pull people in. One of our most successful Snyk projects of all time is this thing called Snyk Advisor. And it started as a DevRel project that we built. And it basically goes off and crawls all the different open source package managers. And it creates these health heuristics for them. And that's something that drove about 33% of all business to Snyk on our website. Was just this one project that we did zero marketing for. It's an engineering project, but it scales sort of like inherently based on the way it works. And so thinking outside the box, getting more creative and doing these things is going to be like even more important going forward for sure.
And that project, that allowed developers to build on top of it too.
Oh yeah, it's huge. Even to this day, if you go to snyk.io/advisor, you'll see what I mean. But it's building stuff like this is super, super helpful.
You just hit on a couple of points that like we've been talking about a lot lately. The first and the shorter one is like people fall into this SEO trap where like if they are actively trying to search for it on your site or like the search volume isn't there, they don't want to write about it. And then they're upset when their competitor wrote about it 6 months early, and then their like page is ranking #1 for this new technology or subject matter or something. It's like, be cutting edge, have faith in what you're communicating about, and that this is where the industry is going, and go ahead and write the piece about it or do the video. We're also noticing like multimedia format, video is huge when it comes to driving users. That eventually, you know, we'll probably get to the point where AI can generate quite a bit of that content for us too. I'm sure, Garrett, you guys got your eyes on that over there also. Yeah. Guys, we didn't have any Q&A today. It was a quiet group. I think everyone's still recovering post like spring break with their kids or families. So we may call this one 6 minutes early, but I will open it up in case either of you have anything that you felt like we didn't hit on today and you'd like to dive into.
I'll add one, or I want to add two things. First of all, if you're not using Mendable, you should go check them out. So I'm plugging Garrett's stuff for him, but please go check out Mendable. They look super great. I'm actually going to be playing around with it soon myself at Snyk here, so highly recommend. And then also, for those of you who are building programs and trying to get more good content, like talk to Clayton and Draft. Like they're a great company. I know you guys are the ones hosting this, and you probably don't want to be super self-promotional, but
yeah,
plug it for you because
I swear I didn't trade Randall.
Bunch. They're great. Like seriously, talk to them, get some help, and don't be a stranger.
Thank you. Snyk, I don't know if you guys even need our help on promotion, but equally, when it comes to security, I mean, we invited you for a reason. We've always been outstanding. You're just, the way you guys handle dev community and sport is incredible over there. I like your focus on entertainment too. As we often see smaller companies, they'll hire sales, and they're just hiring sales guy after sales guy. And then it's like they haven't even thought of making a community hire. They haven't even, I always joke and say you're Colonel Sanders, but you gotta employ that Colonel Sanders as soon as you can take that off of your CEO's plate and have someone out there in the community. I feel like that's just as essential piece of education, documentation of that person that's, scouring the subreddits and the Slack groups and educating on your product too.
If you do a good job hiring in a DevRel function, it will be one of the most business impactful functions at the entire company, guaranteed. Like it has more of a business impact than sometimes an entire combined marketing or like BD function or whatever. And so you can absolutely build these things. They scale really well. And yeah, I'm a huge fan of it. So
you're doing everything: sales, marketing, product, engineering. It's all combined into one org.
We spent a whole hour talking about it last month, so some of these attendees probably don't want to hear me dive into it again. I think a lot of people get sticker shock on that initial hire. They're like, oh my God, we're going to be hiring this marketing person that's going to be pulling in $200K. And it's like, you got to pay them like you're paying an engineer. It's worth the cost. All right, guys, thank you for your time today. Everyone, please join us next month. It looks like we're covering aligning early stage branding content with a couple of friends of ours. We'll be sending out some more information on that. Otherwise, we'll be following up with the recording today. Actually, we did just get a quick question in on the Q&A too. So I'll save up for everyone else that asked this question. We can give you a quick answer to this individual. But thank you, everyone. Garrett, Randall, really appreciate you. This final question: if you have a very diverse user base from technical to less technical, how do you approach this for docs? We sort of tackled this a little bit earlier in the call, but I think the overall summary is start from ground zero. Like, you don't have to describe everything in that single article or that single piece of documentation, but at least give your users the path to finding that information. Would you guys agree with that brief summary there? Cool.
You nailed it.
Awesome. Love it. Thanks, guys. Have a good one. Appreciate everyone joining today. See you later.
See you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.